Welcome back to the Lydia Mugger channel. Today I'm going to do my third and probably last video on undesigned coincidences in the Chambers Hiss testimony. I want to start by briefly going over an undesigned coincidence between Acts and Paul's letters. You can read more about it in detail in Hidden in Plain View. And this concerns Acts 19, verses 21 and 22. Paul's in Ephesus, and it says that at that time he planned to go to Macedonia and Achaia. Achaia was Greece, and then from there on to Jerusalem. And that while he was in Ephesus and decided to stay for a while in Ephesus, he sent Timothy and Erastus ahead into Macedonia. It doesn't mention whether he intended Timothy and or Erastus to continue on to Achaia, or whether they were supposed to wait for him in Macedonia or anything like that. That's just not stated, but just that he sent them into Macedonia. Now, when you go to 1 Corinthians, you find Paul almost explicitly saying that he's in Ephesus, and saying that he is planning to come and see the Corinthians, Corinth, of course, being in Achaia, namely Greece, and that he plans to go through Macedonia and then on to visit them, and also saying that he has sent Timothy ahead. He doesn't mention Erastus. He implies that the letter will reach them before Timothy reaches them. In a very indirect way, we can infer from this that Timothy and the letter may be going by different routes, but he doesn't say that. So we can place 1 Corinthians pretty clearly at that exact time that is told about in Acts 19. And yet, it doesn't seem that the author of Acts has read 1 Corinthians for purposes of trying to place this time in Ephesus at the time when Paul was writing the letter in some sort of faking way, as if he was just researching it, trying to make it look like he knew Paul during this time when he didn't really. If the author of Acts had done that, we would have expected him to say that Paul sent Timothy to Greece, that he sent him to Corinth. In fact, Paul was kind of worried about the Corinthians, and there's no indication anywhere in Acts of that preoccupation in Paul's mind, or of Paul's preoccupation with the collection of money that he was making at this time, which is mentioned extensively in 1st and 2nd Corinthians and in Romans. So it just doesn't appear that it's dependent on the epistles, although it's completely consistent with the epistles. So that's a brief rundown. There are even more correspondences and coincidences there. It's a really rich area, Acts 19 through 20, and comparing that with the epistles, but that just gives you part of it. Now, I want to compare this to the Hiss Chambers testimony. You'll recall that Chambers was saying that he had known Alger Hiss and that he knew all these things about him because he knew him personally. Hiss at first denied having known Chambers at all, and even acted like, he didn't know him when they met face to face, and then eventually said, oh, yes, I think I knew someone named George Crossley, and if it's the same person, he was this down and out who was always trying to get money off of me, and I didn't know him very well, So changed his story in this respect. But again and again, it turned out that Chambers knew details about Hiss that you would find very explicable if they were good friends, but not in the kind of scenario that Hiss was implying when he finally admitted that he knew him at all. And there was external confirmation as well, which I'm not really going into here in any detail. For example, a typewriter was found that belonged to Mr. Hiss, and as you know, old typewriters had very specific sort of signature on the documents, and then, there were pages and pages of documents that Chambers said he had received from Hiss that were typewritten copies of secret state documents, and it turned out it had been typed on Hiss's typewriter. So, there was other evidence as well as to who was telling the truth. But what you found again and again was that Chambers knew these intimate details about Hiss that really looked like they had been good friends. So again, this sort of corresponds to the fact that the author of Acts presents himself as knowing Paul. There are we passages where he says we did this and so forth. And then the kinds of intersections with apparent independence concerning the Pauline epistles support the claim that the author of Acts actually personally knew Paul. So that's the comparison. I want to talk today about Paoli, Pennsylvania, which is a town that came up in the Chambers Hiss testimony. So I'm going to start by reading a bit of the transcript of the committee questioning Chambers. And they ask him what he knows about Alger Hiss's wife. So here it goes. Mr. Stripling, do you know if his wife was a member of a church? Mr. Chambers, she came from a Quaker family. Her maiden name was Priscilla Fansler before she was married. She came from the Great Valley near Paoli, Pennsylvania. Mr. Nixon, did she tell you anything about her family? Mr. Chambers, no, but she once showed me while we were driving beyond Paoli the road down which their farm lay. So, Chambers is claiming to have learned about where Priscilla Hiss was from, where she had grown up in a natural way when they were traveling, when they were driving, and that she pointed to a road, and he said that this was beyond Paoli, and he said she grew up near Paoli, Pennsylvania. And that was the road down which her family's farm lay. All right, now I'm going to read the partial transcript of the committee's questions to Alger Hiss about these same matters, which occurred later. Mr. Nixon, did you testify before what your wife's name was? Mr. Hiss, her name was Priscilla Fansler, her maiden name. Mr. Nixon, where did she come from? What town? Mr. Hiss, she was born in Evanston, Illinois, but spent most of her early life outside of Philadelphia. Mr. Nixon, in Paoli? Mr. Hiss, Frazer. Mr. Nixon, is that near Paoli? Mr. Hiss, it is on the main line, not far from there. Mr. Nixon, did she live there on a farm? Mr. Hiss, her father was in the insurance business and he acquired a small place. I suppose it could be called a farm. Okay, so we notice certain things. Hiss corrects the reference to Paoli and says it was in Fraser. Now, if you look on the map, I'm probably going to use a thumbnail of a current map of Paoli and Fraser. They're very close to one another. And Chambers had said near Paoli, and the Great Valley is this region where they both are. Now, it would be very, very difficult for Chambers to have looked up all this stuff. Maybe in an era of paper records, he could have looked up Priscilla Hiss's wedding license and found out that her maiden name was Fansler. He would have had to do a ton of research to get all the different things. And some, as we noticed last time with the spring water, wouldn't have even been available, in some kind of public records. Now, in the unlikely event that Chambers was planning to try to fake a friendship with Hiss and tried to find out some information from public records about Mrs. Hiss, he might have tried to look up where her family owned property. I don't even know how you would go about that if you didn't know, what region to look or what state to look in or, etc. So that's really far-fetched. But if we assume that what Hiss said is true and that her family's property in the farm country was in Fraser, that would have presumably been on the public record. It would be like here in Kalamazoo, Michigan area, if someone said, I'm from Kalamazoo, and their property is actually in Richland, it's going to say Richland on it, but Kalamazoo would be better known or whatever. So why would Chambers say near Paoli instead of saying in Frazer? If Frazer was the literal location that would be perhaps accessible by some sort of research. And that's parallel to saying if the author of Acts was trying to fake knowing Paul by using the Pauline epistles, why would he say that Paul sent Timothy and Erastus into Macedonia, no mention of sending them to Achaia, rather than saying he sent Timothy to Corinth? And perhaps even saying, for his heart was grieved for the Corinthians or whatever, something that relates it more clearly to what Paul actually says in 1 Corinthians. At least that he was sending him to Corinth instead of saying Macedonia. The two statements are completely compatible, of course, but that kind of compatibility with differences in the way of referring to it is characteristic of witness testimony. I think we can take it that Mr. Hiss is stating truthfully that his wife's family property was in Fraser, but I think we can also take it that Chambers was stating truthfully that her family property was near Paoli. Moreover, Chambers' account of how he knew this is very credible, very believable, and much more believable if they actually were close, as he claimed, than if he were trying to fake a closeness and a friendship that never existed, either because they didn't know one another at all or because they knew one another only in this very distant sort of sporadic way where Hiss despises him basically and has made him some money loans but is sort of trying to get rid of him and so forth. Instead, Chambers communicates a situation where they're traveling together, they're talking together. So Hiss mentions the prothonotary warbler, the bird that he saw. He mentions his childhood job of collecting spring water. And Mrs. Hiss says, our farm used to be down there. Also notice concerning the farm. So my husband's family on his mother's side has a property some ways from here, but here in Michigan, which Tim always refers to as the farm, or often refers to as the farm, but it hasn't in fact been worked as a farm for a very long time. We find that at that time period, the 40s and the 50s, you could have somebody who was an insurance salesman or a lawyer or something, but as a sort of a hobby or some other part of his life would buy a farm property, and he could maybe hire someone else to grow crops on it, or maybe just own it, not grow crops on it, or grow a small crop that he could work on, or maybe own a few animals or something that he could take care of in his free time. That's not uncommon at all, and that's the situation that Hiss seems to be referring to concerning his wife's father. But you can well imagine that as they're driving along, she says, my family's farm is down that road. Okay, and that she would refer to it in a natural way as the farm or something like that, regardless of the extent to which it was a working farm. So it just really fits very well with the situation that Chambers was conveying. I'm bringing this up again because you can see that these are undesigned coincidences, whether they're called that or not. These testimonies appear to be independent. Hiss's testimony takes place later. Hiss certainly doesn't want to confirm what Chambers is saying, okay, but sometimes he does. The prothonotary warbler is probably the most dramatic of these, where he didn't even tumble to the fact that this was something Chambers had mentioned, but just in his enthusiasm says to the member of the committee, have you seen a prothonotary warbler? Because he really is a enthusiastic bird watcher. But their statements tally with variations, and this confirms their having known one another quite well, like Luke and Paul. Next time is going to be Easter. So Easter Sunday. So whether I continue this series or not, which I haven't fully decided, for that week I should do something relating to Easter. So I'm going to probably be talking about a maximal data use of the testimony of James, Jesus' brother. I'm not claiming that we have, a write out of the testimony of James, but of the alleged appearance to James, Jesus' brother, after Jesus rose from the dead. How can a maximal data approach make use of that, and what resources do we have that a minimal facts approach lacks for talking about the conversion of James and the appearance to James? So that'll be a kind of a geeky Easter post. I hope you'll come back to the Lydia McGrew channel, where we're making common sense rigorous.